Some anime characters are strong. Some become legends. But a select few change the meaning of fear itself. Their names started wars. Their return shattered hope. And in some cases, even gods feared them. These weren't warriors. They were disasters. Walking nightmares. The kind of beings whose very existence changed history. And today, we're looking at the anime characters that terrified entire worlds. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why some of these monsters made even other monsters afraid. We begin with perhaps the most terrifying human being in anime history, a man with no powers, no transformations, no supernatural abilities, and yet people feared him more than demons. And that brings us to Johann Liebert, because Johann didn't destroy people with strength. He destroyed them with words. Entire lives were ruined because of him. Families collapsed. Ordinary people became killers. And those who cross his path often describe the same feeling. Pure terror. Because behind that calm smile was something that didn't feel human. And perhaps that's what made Johann so frightening. Because unlike everyone else on this list, someone like Johann could actually exist. And that thought alone is terrifying. But compared to what came next, humans weren't the only ones capable of fear. Because even monsters tremble before this next being. And that brings us to Muzan Kibutsuji. To humanity, he was a nightmare. But strangely enough, humans weren't the ones who feared him most. Demons did. Even the upper moons, the strongest demons alive, trembled before him. One wrong answer, one mistake, and death would come instantly. 4 centuries, generation after generation of demon slayers tried to stop him, and generation after generation failed. His name became synonymous with despair. But perhaps his greatest weapon wasn't his power. It was fear, because even his own followers, monsters capable of slaughtering entire cities, could barely stand in front of him. One glance, one word, one moment of disrespect, and they knew their lives were over. Muzan didn't inspire loyalty. He inspired terror. But compared to what came next, even demons looked insignificant, because this wasn't simply the birth of a king. It was the birth of humanity's successor. And that brings us to Meruem. The moment he opened his eyes, everything changed. Humanity realized something horrifying. They were no longer at the top of the food chain. Meruem wasn't simply powerful. He was evolution itself. Stronger, smarter, faster, superior in every possible way. And Isaac Netero understood the terrifying truth. For the first time in his life, humanity's strongest hunter had encountered something beyond humanity. This wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was humanity fighting extinction. Because if Meruem reached his full potential, the world would belong to him. And everyone knew it. But perhaps the most terrifying part was that Meruem never stopped evolving. Every battle, every experience, every second, he grew stronger, until even Netero realized something. Humanity could not win through strength alone, because they weren't fighting a king. They were fighting the next stage of evolution, and that realization terrified the world. But strength alone isn't what creates fear. Sometimes it's control, and nobody controlled society better than the next man, a monster who ruled from the shadows and made heroes disappear. And that brings us to All for One. Long before heroes became symbols of hope, fear ruled Japan. And that fear had a name. All for One. Heroes vanished, villains flourished, and society slowly fell into darkness. People didn't worship him. They feared him, because his influence reached everywhere. He controlled countless lives from the shadows. And even after his defeat, the fear he created never truly disappeared. Because for many, All for One seemed impossible to destroy. But compared to what came next, even the ruler of the underworld looked human. Because history itself remembered the next name. For 1,000 years, people spoke about him with fear. Not as a king, not as a warrior, but as a calamity. And that brings us to Ryomen Sukuna, the king of curses. Countless sorcerers challenged him, and none could stop him, even after death. His fingers remained objects of terror, spreading fear across generations. But when Sukuna finally returned, everyone realized something horrifying. History had not exaggerated. The legends were true. Then came Shibuya, and disaster itself walked the streets. Buildings collapsed, entire districts were reduced to ruins, and thousands of lives vanished. In an instant, even powerful sorcerers understood. This wasn't a battle. It was a catastrophe. But perhaps the moment that truly showed the difference between Sukuna and everyone else came during his fight against Jogo, one of the strongest curses alive, a being feared by both humans and curses. And yet, standing before Sukuna, Jogo looked helpless, completely overwhelmed. And after defeating him, Sukuna acknowledged his strength, words that would become legendary. Stand proud. You are strong, coming from the king of curses himself. Those words carried more weight than anyone could imagine, because praise from a monster is something few ever receive. But perhaps the most terrifying enemy isn't the strongest. It's the one who already knows your next move, a man who turned reality itself into an illusion. And that brings us to Sasuke Aizen. By the time people discovered the truth, it was already too late, because everything had gone according to his plan. Captains, lieutenants, entire armies, everyone had been dancing in the palm of his hand. His intelligence, his patience, and his mastery over Kyoka Suigetsu made him almost impossible to understand. Because how do you fight someone when you can't even trust your own eyes? Perhaps his most iconic moment came when Ichigo and his allies finally arrived, filled with hope, certain that victory was within reach, only for Aizen to stop Ichigo's theme with a single finger. At that moment, everyone understood. The gap between them was overwhelming, and perhaps that was Aizen's greatest weapon. Not strength, not immortality, but hopelessness. Because before anyone even realized it, they had already lost. But even Sasuke Aizen couldn't control the future, because the next man didn't merely predict destiny. He had the power to rewrite it, and his return terrified the Soul Society itself. And that brings us to Yawok. For 1,000 years, the Soul Society feared one thing, his return, because legend spoke of a king who would one day return and bring about the end of everything. That king was Yawok, the father of the Quincy, a being so terrifying that even after 1,000 years, his name still inspired fear. And when he finally returned, everything changed. Bankai was stolen, captains fell, and hope slowly disappeared, because Yawok possessed something far more terrifying than strength. The Almighty, the power to see countless futures, and even worse, the power to change them. How do you defeat an enemy who has already seen your victory? How do you fight when the future itself is against you? For the first time in centuries, the Soul Society stood on the brink of destruction, and many realized something horrifying. Perhaps victory was impossible, but compared to what came next, even destiny itself could not prepare the world, because if there was one man whose very existence shattered hope, it was this next legend. And that brings us to Madara Uchiha. Entire nations united against one man, and somehow they were still afraid, because deep down, everyone understood. They weren't fighting a shinobi, they were fighting a legend. Then came the fourth great ninja war, and the impossible happened. Madara returned, and within moments, the battlefield became a nightmare. Thousands of shinobi stood before him. Yet it didn't matter, because this wasn't a battle. It was domination. Then came the moment every Naruto fan remembers. Madara summoned a meteor from the heavens, and just when everyone thought it was over, a second meteor appeared. At that moment, hope itself began to disappear. But perhaps his most terrifying moment came later, when Madara looked upon the entire Shinobi Alliance and asked a question that instantly became legendary. Would these clones use Susanoo or not? Thousands of shinobi, the greatest alliance in history, and yet they looked helpless, because they finally understood. Madara wasn't treating them as enemies. He was treating them as children. Legendary shinobi fell before him. The 5 Kage were overwhelmed, and even heroes who had inspired generations could do nothing, because Madara Uchiha was no longer fighting for victory. He was fighting for amusement, and perhaps that was what made him truly terrifying. Not hatred, not revenge, but complete confidence, because in his mind, defeat had never been a possibility. But even Madara, the man who shattered hope itself, could not escape one thing: death. And eventually, death answered. And that brings us to Sung Jinwoo, the weakest hunter alive, the man nobody respected, the hunter everyone mocked, an E rank, a title that meant weakness, failure, and insignificance. No one feared Sung Jinwoo. No one believed in him. But fate had other plans, because after surviving the double dungeon, everything changed. Battle after battle, death after death, Sung Jinwoo evolved, growing stronger, faster, and more terrifying, until eventually he stopped feeling human, because Sung Jinwoo had become something far greater, the Shadow Monarch, and with that title came an army unlike anything the world had ever seen. Then came the moment that every solo leveling fan remembers. One word: arise, and suddenly, death itself had an army. Fallen enemies returned, legends returned, entire battlefield became his kingdom, because for Sung Jinwoo, death was no longer the end. It was recruitment, and perhaps that was what made him so terrifying. Not simply his strength, but the fact that the more enemies he defeated, the larger his army became. Monarchs feared him, rulers respected him, and even beings that stood above humanity recognized the Shadow Monarch as a force beyond comprehension. Dark skies, countless shadows, and millions of soldiers waiting for a single command. It was a sight that inspired one thing: fear. Because when Sung Jinwoo appeared, people no longer asked, "Can we win?" They asked, "Can we survive?" But even the Shadow Monarch, the embodiment of death itself, wasn't the final existence on this list, because beyond monsters, beyond kings, beyond legends, and even beyond death, there exists a being, feared by gods, and that brings us to Zeno. There are powerful beings, they are gods, and then there is Zeno, the ruler of all universes, a being so far beyond everyone else, that even the gods of destruction fear him. Even angels respect him, because unlike the others on this list, Zeno doesn't need armies, he doesn't need plans, and he doesn't need to fight, because with a single thought, entire universes disappear, timelines vanish, reality itself ceases to exist, without anger, without hatred, without effort. And perhaps that's what makes Zeno truly terrifying. Not cruelty, not rage, but indifference, because to Zeno, the fate of existence itself is nothing more than a game, and when gods themselves are afraid, you know you've reached a level beyond fear. But what do you think? Did we miss someone? Should Saitama have been here? What about Aino's Voltigode? Or perhaps Rimuru Tempest? Let us know in the comments, because fear doesn't belong to the weak. It belongs to the monsters strong enough to make the world tremble. And these were the anime characters that terrified entire worlds. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe, because in the world of anime, there are always greater legends waiting to be discovered.